Welcome back to another Hedera DeFi Corner where we get into everything Hedera DeFi. Brady, welcome back, buddy.
Hey, thanks so much for having me, man. Reporting from Arizona.
There you go. There you go. So, before we dive into everything we're going to get into, I want to make sure everybody understands the risks that are involved with DeFi. There are smart contract risks. Of course, there's market risks. There's impermanent loss risk. Make sure you understand that stuff. Make sure you understand the laws and regulations in your local jurisdiction before getting involved. But, Brady, just diving into some of the news we have going on. Starting off, we have a few listings as far as Hedera tokens out there. We have LCX, which listed Dovu, and then we also have HBAR getting listed and Sauce getting listed on a Filipino exchange called Coins. What are your thoughts in general around Hedera tokens getting listed on centralized exchanges, and how important is that for our ecosystem?
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts on centralized exchange listings. I think overall, these listings are a great thing for the ecosystem. One of the biggest aspects of this that I find useful is when these tokens are listed on these exchanges and more exchanges are supporting Hedera ecosystem assets, they're updating their centralized exchange infrastructure to be able to support the Hedera token service standard, which is not exactly a one-to-one fit the way that maybe ERC20 assets are on centralized exchanges, various EVM networks that all function the same. It's a little bit more easy for centralized exchanges to support ERC20 assets on every network because the standard is the same. With HTS, they have to do some manual configurations and architecture changes to be able to support that and the nuances of the Hedera network. So, seeing more centralized exchanges listing any HTS assets, I think are a good thing. We also know that ERC20 assets are already exist on the Hedera network now as well. And so, the ability for centralized exchanges to support both standards for the Hedera network is going to be helpful. From a project perspective, I think it's great because it creates accessibility for the asset and its utility across a number of different regions. And so for people who don't want access to DeFi or don't have access to DeFi, their ability to get exposure to the asset through centralized exchange mechanisms. And so the risk-wise for centralized exchange listings, the way that Bonds of Finance Foundation thinks about it in discussions is just around the concept of whether there's enough volume and demand and the maintenance that goes into having a listing on a centralized exchange. So, one example is ensuring that prices across trading venues are all reflective of the same price, which requires, arbitrage to take place. There's a number of organizations that are third party and independent that go in and would support arbitrage, but also there's, aspects of market making and, ensuring order books are not too thin and then also just demand in general. And so, we've seen in the past, you could get listed on a centralized exchange, but if the volume isn't there, if the demand's not there, delisting. And so, the ultimate path would be sort of as the project grows in awareness, especially outside of the Hedera ecosystem, and projects find centralized exchanges to list on, they're strategically doing that in such a way that it's giving access to the regions and the people that have the demand and would want to use it.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. But one of the things that I'm wondering about is, of course, we know that HTS tokens are a powerful tool, but you mentioned how it's easier to integrate with ERC20s. Is that something that teams should consider when they're launching a token? Should they consider using an ERC20, or should we just kind of force it that we want HTS tokens to be launched on these centralized exchanges and kind of push the issue with these centralized exchanges and say we want support for both?
So look, I think when there's a network that has enough demand and traction and interest, everybody else is going to bend to your will. So Solana is a great example. It's not EVM, it's a Rust-based programming language. Tokens are a completely different standard. They gained the traction, the interest, the developer activity, the retail users to be able to command everyone to adapt to them, whether it's bridges or centralized exchanges or whatever. So there's something to be said about not wanting to compromise on some of the most differentiation and like strategic differentiation from a technical perspective that Hedera has, like the Hedera token service. While at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, I think you do have to meet halfway if you can't command the mass adoption like some of the like very standout players have, like an Ethereum or a Solana. And so, the ability for us to do both as an ecosystem, I think, is really great. I think, not financial advice or legal advice in any way, but if you're gonna think about launching a token, ERC20 today, it's at the beginnings to the middle stages of the ecosystem being able to support that. But long-term trajectory-wise, the way I see it is it's going to be robust support for both HTS and for ERC20. So long-term wise, I don't see like an issue with choosing either or. The way I personally think about it, though, is there is sort of strategic reasons why you would want to use ERC20 or modified ERC20 versus Hedera token service. The biggest one or most top of mind is modified ERC20 and having it be an EVM asset allows for a strong degree of programmability. And so usually like liquidity pool tokens, for example, they can be rebasing assets. They can have certain types of programmability built into them. They're technically an ERC20 standard, but there's modifications to them that allow them to best serve their utility as a liquidity pool token. So like Bonzo lend liquidity pool tokens, there's specific things that you can and cannot do with them, but they're technically an ERC20. If there's programmability that you need and it's not just a standard token, I think EVM ERC20 / modified EVM ERC20 is the best route if you're a developer. If it's just an ERC20 asset, there's no programmability that you're doing, it would be otherwise just like writing a contract for ERC20 token, then I would choose probably HTS as the asset. So that's at least how we're thinking about it.
All right, understood. So we do have some really big things that came out over the past couple of weeks. Well, one really big thing, and then something we're just starting to get information about now. The latter is a new platform called Vols. Now, I don't have all the information around this quite yet. I've heard grumblings that it is a DEX, that it is going to focus on enterprise, but it's also going to have some services for retail as well. What have you heard about Vols so far?
Yeah, so I know the founder over at Vols. He's been a longtime Hedera ecosystem community member, engagement around council related things. He actually introduced my co-founder and I, or reintroduced us actually. So that was really cool. And in my understanding of Vols, and I don't want to speak too much for him. I'm sure this is an interview that you'll probably do in the future. It's a more institutionally focused decentralized exchange. And so,
Okay.
yes, there's going to be some aspects for retail. I wouldn't call it like label it enterprise though, actually. I think it's like Web3 institutions that are still like bleeding it.
Okay.
But, large quantities of trades that they would be wanting to fill. And then the bet I think that's being made here is, there are a lot of benefits to being built on Hedera for DeFi that don't get discussed too broadly when it comes to institutional adoption yet. A big one is just like no front running because of fair ordering of transactions and no inherent MEV. And that's huge for institutions that are making a multi-million-dollar trade on a DEX where some person comes in and tries to like sandwich attack or, do something that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do on Hedera because of some of its inherent features, I think is great. And so they're trying to capture that market. I think it's kind of what Hedera was really built for as well.
Well, I've also heard that they want to pinch settlement times down to the milliseconds. I don't even know how that's possible on Hedera, but I'm sure that they have some plans in place. Now, of course, this show is brought to you by Bonzo Finance and Saucer Swap. And, there's going to be some competition there, but I think that only brings out the best in everything. And I think Saucer Swaps established themselves enough that they're not going to have a problem competing across the board. And we have some interesting things to talk about as far as Saucer Swap as well. But another huge piece of news that came out almost 2 weeks ago, right after our last show, was Stargate. And the fact that we're getting wrapped assets coming across using layer 0 at really low costs into the Hedera ecosystem. The first place that they're available is on Saucer Swap. Tell us how you're thinking about Stargate and the impacts on the Hedera network.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming. We've been talking about bridging since the first DeFi corner and even before that. I'm elated that we have bridging live now, our first asset that's available through what would otherwise be like a ubiquitous bridge that Web3 as a broader retail space acknowledges as sort of a go-to. We've had Hashport in the past. Hashport's great. I think when it comes to like broader awareness, Stargate has that acknowledgement just of retail users across the whole industry, which I think helps. So the more bridges, the better. And wrapped ETH being the first asset was strategically important because that, I'd argue has the highest total addressable market, the total highest propensity for people to be able to bridge that asset into Hedera. I also, we'll talk about saucer swap, but setting up bridging and supporting specific assets is only one piece of a much larger puzzle that needs to be solved all in coordination, which is it's not just make it accessible to bridge, but then the question is, well, what do they do when they've bridged the asset over? Is there incentives for them to want to bridge the asset over? Can they do things with it? Is there enough liquidity? Kind of an endless list there. And so I think when we think about bridging, we can't just think about it in isolation. We have to think about it in like a broader ecosystem context.
Makes perfect sense to me. Now, one of the things you brought up is Hashport, and I love the team over there at Hashport. Jesse's one of my favorite people in the ecosystem, a true, HBAR barbarian from the very beginning. But they have had fairly high fees, and that's kind of what happens when you don't have a fair amount of competition. I'm not even sure where Stargate is. I've seen conflicting information. Pretty much the fees are low, especially going from Hedera, but they could be higher on Ethereum. I saw that there was the cost of transacting is just those gas fees. I've also seen that there's a UX cost of 0.06% compared to where Hashport, and I don't know which one that is, but Hashport was at 0.5%. So I'm not sure how Hashport is going to start to compete here. I wanted to get your thoughts on how Hashport competes and the competition you see coming from Stargate and how that interaction between those two players, the OG player and the new player, are going to have on our DeFi space.
There's room for many bridges, I think, in the same way that there's room for multiple types of dexes. And, in many cases, when there exists multiple sort of versions of something that offers utility to an ecosystem, it is that they are addressing a certain market segment versus one that is addressing a different market segment. And so, the way that I see this potentially playing out is bridges figuring out which segment it is that they're trying to address and then ensuring that they blow it out on features, functionalities, whatever that ensures the best experience for that segment. And I know long-term, Hashport has always positioned themselves as sort of an enterprise bridge where maybe you do pay a little bit of a premium as maybe an institution or an enterprise that wants to utilize their service because there's maybe stronger degrees of trust that they have for it, or the flexibility that the team has, for example, of doing sort of custom offerings and integrations and supports for tokens. So there's room for everybody to play in here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. From a retail perspective, though, I think having Stargate with the low fees is really important. Fees are obviously an important aspect of ensuring that retail, is able to successfully bring assets over and start playing in Hedera. I think Stargate also does like a dust mechanism too. So being able to, if you bridge an asset onto a Hedera network, it gives you a few HBAR to be able to play with. And I know there's some rumblings about something similar too that would be coming with regards to that dust mechanism, but can't say too much more beyond that.
I actually could have some information coming up this week that should be in my next weekly update that might cover some of that stuff that actually Hashport is working on as well. But the next thing I want to dive into here, Brady, is specifically about Saucer Swap. And this is something that we just started to post things through. Let me take a look here. Through Sauce Buybacks. So if you follow at Sauce Buyback on X, you'll see this. And we know that DEXs are some of the most viable businesses in the space, but this kind of hit me. And it was just going through how much Saucer Swap is buying back every single day. And if you go through it, just yesterday, we had about 30,000 sauce that was bought back. That was about $1,600 worth. Same thing on the day before. That was about $1,600 worth, $1,200 worth, $1,600 worth, $1,200 worth, $3,400 worth, $1,000 worth, $1,200 worth, $1,800 worth. And Brady, this isn't just sauce that's being bought back and put into the saucer swap treasury, but this is actually going into that single-sided staking pool that is going right back to the sauce or X-sauce holders in this case. And Brady, when I started to follow this and I saw this starting to pop up on my timeline, it just really reiterated to me how good these DEX businesses are. And it's across the entire space, but I think as Hedera continues to see success, Saucer Swap is going to continue to get a fair amount of that market share, and this is only going to grow over time. What were your thoughts around what we saw there? And I know I don't want to put anything into your mouth here, but are you thinking about the same kind of mechanisms for, or actually, I think you already have some of those same mechanisms when it comes to Bonzo. What are your thoughts on buybacks?
Yeah, it's become a super popular mechanism, I think, for a number of projects now in Hedera. I think Saucer Swap was the one that really kicked that off as sort of a standard. You have Hashpack that's doing similar thing. Dovu just announced a similar thing. Bonzo's been doing sort of buyback mechanisms as well. You could even argue that Forevermints with the NFT ecosystem is a form of buybacks as well. And yeah, that's a very sort of common trend now across the board. I think it being an automated sort of function within a protocol, especially if it's like a DAO that's running the protocol, such as Saucer Swap, Bonzo, etc. Having folks that are governance token holders being able to vote on, hey, what percentage of these things actually goes towards maybe a staking mechanism, ensuring that all of it is a sort of automated, trustless system. All of that is great. I think there's real value in being able to have a buyback mechanism as part of a protocol.
Well, that's one of the other things that I was reminded of. I was kind of walking through Karate. Of course, Karate has not been a great token, but I was reminding people that the business is still doing well, even though they've been quiet here for a while. There's going to be a lot of good stuff going on here in the future. And I was reminded of, because that market has taken such a big dip, that in the beginning, you'll remember really well, when the HBAR launched it about 10 cents or so. It spiked up on that first day, and then it trended down to about 1 cent, and then it recovered on from there. And of course, we're at about a 10x from there. But it's not just that 10x. There's so many opportunities here in the DeFi space that you can give yourself some additional bonuses. And I've been able to enjoy a lot of that, whether that's Stater. We had some decent rewards when it came to Hedera staking. I've been doing a lot of providing liquidity in the space. There's just a lot of other opportunities that it's not just the principal appreciation, but you have all of these other opportunities that are out there, and they're just getting better over time.
It's a good segue to our next topic, actually.
well, we certainly want to onboard people into the space, and those yield opportunities are one way to get in there. But you've launched another platform to get a lot of people into the space. What do you have for us?
Yeah, so this was under the umbrella of the Hashgraph DeFi Alliance, which constitutes a number of DeFi, wallet, etc. projects in the Hedera ecosystem. It's sort of an independent entity that coordinates around DeFi. I think as an ecosystem, having tight coordination around moving parts and ensuring people aren't duplicating work, ensuring that standards are all aligned is really important. And so Bonzo Finance Labs is part of the Hashgraph DeFi Alliance. And so this was a project that I did under that umbrella. And HBAR Guide ideally its mission is to be the fastest and easiest way to onboard into the Hedera on-chain economy and ecosystem. And it's a step-by-step guide that walks you through all of the steps that you would need to take as a retail or even an institutional user trying to get onboarded into Hedera. So, starts out with just an introduction with some metrics that are powered by HGraph.io, dives into installing a Hedera ecosystem wallet, and includes a drop-down menu that says, hey, if you're coming from another EVM network or Solana, check out how it's a little bit different. There is some nuances to Hedera, and oftentimes it's a little bit hard to explain to people what those nuances are. And this just, tightly explains that to them in an easy to understand way. Getting a wallet, buying HBAR or Hedera native USDC on centralized exchanges, all of the bridges that exist and the various assets that are supported by them. As you just mentioned, staking on Hedera, so liquid staking with Stater, and then native staking with just staking an account to a Hedera node. DEXs, so we've got, Saucer Swap, eventually Vols will be on there, Orbit, lending, meme coins, NFTs, just trying to get sort of capturing just like the highest level of each category as the most brief introduction of like, there is stuff on Hedera. There's a lot going on, very strong and robust community. And this is your fastest path to be able to get started. And so, my hope would be to see folks start to share this with people on X or their friends or family or whatever. If someone's trying to get started, it's a really easy to use guide. And so I hope it gets used for that. None of the projects, protocols, etc., are, to be taken as like an endorsement in any way. And so there's some disclaimers on the site as well. Excited to have been able to launch this.
No, this is perfect. I mean, it is that one-stop onboarding mechanism that we've needed in this space. So well done. We appreciate everything you do, not just running your company. Of course, that's the most value you bring into the space with Bonzo Finance, but other things like this are invaluable as well. And the last thing we want to touch on as far as news is, I know people have been wondering when HTS tokens, Hedera tokens, were going to be supported by Ledger. We're just starting to see that now. We have USDC, the Hedera version, now being supported on Ledger. So if you want to store your HBAR on there, that's been possible for a long time, and now we're getting USDC as well, and that is an HTS token. So all of the other HTS tokens, now they have that infrastructure in place, and it'll be a lot easier for them to support those other tokens as well. So I don't think it'll be too long. Now, Brady, I'm sure that when these other tokens start to get support on Ledger, Bonzo is probably going to be one of the first ones. So I'm not going to put you on the spot right now, as when you actually do get on there, you can come back on and tell us all about it. But I do want to get into some of the yield opportunities we have going on in the Hedera ecosystem. We're going to start off with V1 over on Saucer Swap, and HBAR, HBAR X, you're getting about 2%. On Sauce HBAR, you're getting 14%. USDC HBAR, 15%. That's again on V1. HBAR Steam is at 20%. HBAR BSL is at 22%. HBAR X Sauce is at about 9%. HBAR Pack at 17%. HBAR DaVinci at 45%. And then HBAR Gib is at 6%. Moving over to V2, and this is concentrated liquidity, so you're not getting the full span of potential prices between these two assets, and it doesn't give you as much information from week to week because the concentration of that liquidity could be different for each of these pools, but I still think it's important to cover. So on USDC HBAR, you're at 45%. Wrapped BNB, which has been moving a fair amount lately, Wrapped BNB HBAR is at 120%. Sauce HBAR at 12%. HBAR Bonzo at 4%, HBAR Dovu at 263%, USDC Wrapped ETH, that's the new version that was just bridged over using Stargate, that's at 1%, Sauce X Sauce is at 7%, Jam HBAR at 71%, and HBAR Karate at 3.2%. Now, of course, when you provide those pairs for the liquidity pool on Saucer Swap, you do have the potential for impermanent loss. I'm not going to run through impermanent loss right now. There's plenty of great resources that explain that fairly fully. But if you don't want to take that risk and you still want some yield, another place you can go is over on Bonzo Finance. If you supply HBAR, right now you're getting about 0.42%, which is certainly better than what you're seeing for native staking. For supplying USDC, you're getting 4%, Bonzo nearly 10%. 0.8% for Sauce, 0.4% for Karate, about 0.5% for Pack, about 3.5% for Grelf, and the native token for the Kabila platform, KBL, is giving you about 5%. So, Brady, that's all I have as far as yield opportunities right there. But let's take a look at some of the metrics we have going on in the Hedera ecosystem and see what the health looks like.
Awesome. Let's do it. So DeFi TVL to kick things off. And these metrics are from DeFi Llama. We're looking at around $229.08 million in US dollar denominated TVL, which is inclusive of liquid staking tokens as well. And then 1.067 billion HBAR in HBAR denominated value. Going sideways still, a little bit of an uptick, but nothing major to report on here. The hope, people are probably sick of hearing me talk about vaults at this point. We do have that coming.
Not at all. I'm excited about them. They're coming soon, right?
Appreciate that. Yeah. coming in October, one of the goals of that being available for users is there is a lot of liquidity that exists in wallets or accounts on the network that isn't being utilized in DeFi. In our discussions with users, oftentimes they're a bit intimidated in supplying liquidity, even just to like regular saucer swap pools or Bonzo, or especially V2 pools where there's configuration and maintenance and a number of things, and there's a bit of a learning curve. With vaults coming online, the hope is that there's the ability to capture some of this dormant liquidity across the ecosystem, make it really easy for users, and sort of contribute to that overall TVL metric and the DeFi ecosystem as a whole. So fingers are crossed that ends up becoming the case, but definitely be on the lookout for vaults. I'm sure we'll do an interview that's like dedicated once that goes live, and we can go through all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to the first ones that are going to come out. And what are we looking at for DEX volume?
Yeah, so DEX volume, we're closing out the month here with 226.66 million in US dollar denominated value for this month of September. And then in HBAR denominated value, close to a billion. Trending downwards from the high that we had in like July. There was a sort of price and activity spike. The chart's really interesting because it follows the trend of basically the whole market in terms of activity. It makes sense that it would. And hopefully we continue to see this cycle, play out the way that we think it might. So next up is stablecoins, and on Hedera, the big focus has been around Hedera native USDC. First up is stablecoin TVL, which is the stablecoins that are locked in DeFi protocols in the ecosystem, and then we'll jump into stablecoin liquidity, which is just the overall amount of Hedera native USDC that is available and technically tradable in the ecosystem. We're still working through a USDC velocity metric and comparisons. So hopefully we have that on the next DeFi corner. Great suggestion by one of the watchers and community members. So apologies we couldn't make it for this one, but definitely trying to get something really nice for the next one. So looking at stablecoin TVL for Hedera native USDC, it's sitting at about $8.93 million. It's down from about 20 million from the last DeFi corner a couple of weeks ago. This is primarily constituted in Saucer Swap and in Bonzo Finance. You can see the charts here as well for the two protocols and the amount of liquidity. And on the Bonzo side, how much of that liquidity is actively being borrowed as well in that purple line. And then stablecoin liquidity overall. Again, this is the Hedera native USDC that is available in wallets and technically circulating in the ecosystem, sort of available for trading, not in sort of a Circle Treasury account on the network. So there's a distinction there. And that's sitting at about $115.27 million. We see large spikes and drops here. We've kind of noted in the past, if you're a first-time listener, this metric isn't the most reliable in terms of progress just because of how volatile it is. I'd say the TVL metric is the one that we really want to look out for, and then the coming soon velocity metric as well is going to be very interesting to see, especially if there's the ability to do comparisons with other networks too. So on an uptrend again for that, for what it's worth, but I'm sure we'll see more volatility moving forward as well. And then finally, staking. So liquid staking with Stater Labs and HBAR X is sitting at about 4.33%. And then native staking to Hedera Network node is at 0.02%. I know there was some discussion on X, maybe you want to talk about with regards to native staking and the research that's going on with the Hedera Foundation around that.
Yeah, so it was the first time we've seen Charles and the Hedera Foundation say anything really about native staking at all. And, of course, right now it's pretty anemic, 0.02%. So you're really not getting anything for it. But the comments that were made by Charles responding to somebody in the space. And he was talking about how through their research, they've realized that 5 to 7%. We had 6.5% before. That can actually be detrimental for a platform, for a token, and so forth. But the sweet spot is there between 1.5% and 2.5%, and of course we max out right there around 5%, depending on how many people are staking. And all they have to do right now is fund account 800. But the fact that Charles was saying, that's the sweet spot, that's what they found is actually beneficial for a platform, I think that indicates that they're looking at possibly funding account 800. And right now, with how much we have staked, it would probably max out initially at about 2.5% and then drift down a little bit, since once you've incentivized people to start staking again, that number would, or the amount would increase. And I think at 6.5 billion HBAR staked, it starts to bring that level of staking yield down a little bit. So I think it would trend down a little bit once they've fully funded that, but I do think that would have a huge impact on, the ecosystem as a whole. I think it's good for the people that are participating in the HBAR economy. The ones that are being successful, they get that little bit of an extra kicker for holding on to that HBAR, and it could just make things vibrant across the board. Things like single-sided staking for Saucer Swap could be enhanced with those kind of rewards as well. And, all kinds of protocols. We have Bonzo Finance, they might benefit as well, and just go on from there. So I think it's good that they're thinking about it, but I think they also want to be strategic around when they actually do that. And, you want some hype, you want some excitement. And until we get to that point, whether it's just regular market action, whether it's something specific to Hedera that's doing well, who knows what that could be? Maybe the ETF launches. Then you also add the staking on top of that, and that could get people really excited and bring us to a whole new level. So, I love staking rewards. I think it's a really good way to get tokens out, to take the treasury and get them out to the ecosystem. And the other thing that I think about is, you might have higher opportunities on as far as nominal yield on other platforms, but like Solana has built-in inflation. And if you take that into consideration and knock that off the top, your actual real staking yields are only like 1%. And that goes for other platforms as well. Make sure that if you're participating in staking on another platform, you take into consideration that inflation yield as well. But considering that, I'm not sure if you saw Charles' comments, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts that are at a higher level, just around like staking in general as a concept. So the way that I view all of these networks is they are like digital nation states in their truest form. At full decentralization, I think they can very easily be viewed that way. They have governance, a government system. They have, with various forms, we have the council, but there's also like a fully democratic system of token holders voting on proposals. There's a number of different ways to structure it. I am a fan of the governance model. I think it's a good one. The second aspect of it is a national currency. So every network, for the most part, has their own national currency. For Hedera, it's HBAR. For the Ethereum network, it's ETH. Solana, it's Sol. And then you have businesses that set up shop in these economies. And businesses and developers want to set up shop in economies that are thriving. And when you think about it through the lens of it being a nation state, staking is something that I view as an economic lever that exists the same way like maybe the United States has economic levers that we use. The Fed rate is a great one and very topical for right now, where those rates that are set and used change the behavior of the economy and of the people participating in that economy. And so, it is great to see the research that Hedera Foundation is doing. It's cool that they're coming back with, interesting thoughts on that. I really hope and am curious to read like reports of their findings with regards to staking and sort of how they derived, the rate that they ultimately end up coming up with. Or maybe there's no change and they have good justification for that. And that would be interesting as well. So a lot of curiosity on that front. Hedera's staking is really interesting though, because, unlike other networks, it's almost as if Hedera has native liquid staking built in. You don't stake tokens to nodes. There's no bonding. There's no slashing. The way that staking works is because of the consensus mechanism and the way that the nodes operate, you don't need bonding or slashing in this sort of punitive form. And you stake your account, you don't stake the tokens themselves. And with that, you can move tokens in and out of the account as long as, the certain number of tokens are in the account for a 24-hour period. You're able to accumulate rewards and you get paid out every time the next transactions happen after that 24-hour period. Whereas with like Ethereum, staking is something that you have to have a minimum amount that you stake to a node. There are services that have been spun up like Stater Labs or Lido where you can get a liquid staking token, and then Lido handles being able to stake and meet that minimum requirement for an Ethereum nodes, multiple Ethereum nodes, that they stake those tokens that they receive and issue a liquid staking token to those nodes. But with Ethereum, it also, there's a mechanism of price as part of it. So you're reducing token velocity when you are required to lock up tokens for staking. And we've seen a lot of news lately about, on Ethereum, a certain amount of tokens that are able to be unlocked after a 7-day cool-off period. And so they're looking at that as a metric of basically like, how many tokens are going to be influxed into the ecosystem that would then be available to be sold. And again, that cooldown period is really important as part of that. So Hedera misses the benefit of reduction of token velocity with regards to staking on this front, but ultimately it's a cleaner and more efficient staking mechanism, I'd argue. And looking through the lens of it being an economic lever, I think is really important.
Great insights as always, Brady. And to finish my one thought there, my point around the inflation on these different networks, Hedera, even though the supply has been increasing over time in circulating supply, the total supply doesn't move, right? It's 50 billion tokens. That number won't change. All indications are that it won't change. So you don't have to worry about that additional inflation on top of it. So Brady, I think that's pretty much all we have for today. Thank you so much for coming on again, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Sounds great. Thanks so much for having me.